Hello comrades, it's the Finnish Bolshevik. Who decided that Lenin's body would be preserved and displayed in a glass case in the Lenin mausoleum? We're often told by anti-communists and sometimes by Trotskyists that Stalin completely cynically and opportunistically decided that Lenin should be mummified and his body should be preserved so that they can create a cult of personality around him and they can opportunistically use that to solidify Stalin's power. What is the actual truth of the matter? Well, I was reading a book called Practicing Stalinism by historian Arch Getty, and he actually talks about this. This is a very interesting anecdote. So I'm just going to read some sections from this book and comment on them. So Getty says, quote, "Nothing would be easier and more obvious than to imagine that upon Lenin's death, his successors, with Stalin in the lead, quickly gathered in a back room and immediately understood the utility of preserving, displaying, and worshipping his body. A top-down manufactured cult of Lenin would then provide a substitute religion for the peasants, complete with the sainted founder's relics to replace the Russian orthodoxy they were trying to destroy. It would enhance the legitimacy of Lenin's successors and of the regime in general by tracing that regime's descent from a founder who was rapidly and intentionally become a mythical progenitor on whose pyramid the successor acolytes would stand to demonstrate their lineage." This idea, which is not uncommon in the scholarly literature, assumes that the Bolsheviks had a plan. Here it seems that there was no plan, no major role for Stalin, but rather a series of contradictory, ad hoc, and contested proposals, reflecting input both from below and above. Lenin's successors stumbled and bumbled for a long time about what to do with his body. First of all, it seems that Stalin had little, if anything, to do with the decision to permanently display Lenin. What? So Getty is telling us that Stalin had nothing to do with it? Well, that certainly is a very different story than what we're usually told. Let's go on. Quote, "He was not on the Lenin Funeral Commission, chaired by Felix Dzerzhinsky, where such decisions were made, and his associate, Kliment Voroshilov, that's Stalin's associate, so Stalin's guy, Voroshilov, who was also in the commission headed by Dzerzhinsky, Kliment Voroshilov, who was a member, bitterly opposed the idea. Stalin was a member of the Politburo, which, as it turned out, approved all the recommendations of the commission, but he seems to have played no active role in the decision." Unquote. So there was the Lenin Funeral Commission headed by Dzerzhinsky, where Stalin's guy, Voroshilov, was in the committee, but Voroshilov actually opposed the idea of preserving Lenin's body. Let's keep reading. Quote, "According to rumors that surfaced decades later, in the 1960s, Stalin had been the initiator of the idea to mummify Lenin even before Lenin died, having supposedly suggested it at an informal meeting of Politburo members in 1923, at which time Trotsky vehemently opposed the idea. This story is quite improbable on its face. The idea that such a careful political tactician as Stalin would openly talk about disposing of Ilyich's body while the latter was still alive, and in the presence of his arch-rival Trotsky, borders on the ridiculous." Unquote. And in my opinion, it doesn't border on being ridiculous, it is flat out ridiculous. And it's also not based on anything, it's just a BS rumor. Quote, "The senior leaders would consider it unpardonably crude to have such a discussion while their dear Lenin lived, and Stalin would certainly not have handed Trotsky such a faux pas on a platter." The decision to preserve and display Lenin's body was taken incrementally over a period of years, and it was not until 1929 to 30 that his resting place was finalized in the stone mausoleum. At first, on 24th of January 1924, Lenin was put in the Kremlin's Hall of Columns for viewing by the public. Professor Abrikosov embalmed the body in customary fashion so it would last the 3 days until the funeral and burial. Nobody contemplated a longer viewing. 2 days later, the huge crowds obliged the Politburo to order moving the display to Red Square near the Kremlin wall, unquote. So at this point, because there were so many people who wanted to see Lenin, they had to move it outside to the Red Square next to the Kremlin wall, which is, as you probably know, that is where the Lenin mausoleum is. So the body was moved there. Quote, architect A.V. Shkusev was quickly conscripted to design and build a temporary structure there, which was thrown together by 27th of January. The crowds kept coming, and soon Shkusev was charged with designing a larger structure that was completed some weeks later. But it was not made to last. It was a wooden structure called the Temporary Mausoleum, unquote. So at this point, there was never any plan to preserve the body. They were just supposed to display it for 3 days, but because the crowd was too big, they had to move it outside, which is why they quickly threw up a temporary structure, and then they improved it to make another temporary structure called the Temporary Mausoleum. But there's still no actual plan to mummify the body. Quote, meanwhile, during the extended viewing period, Lenin's body began to decay. The Dzerzhinsky Commission was consequently faced with making a longer-term decision about the body. In February, Commission member and engineer Leonid Krasin claimed that he could preserve the body through freezing. And on the 7th, the Commission authorized him to buy expensive German machinery for that purpose. By 14th of March, the body continued to deteriorate, and although Krasin continued to defend the freezing idea, the Commission brought in professors Sparsky and Vorobev with a new chemical procedure for long-term preservation. It was not until 26th of July that the Commission made the final decision to embalm and display Lenin forever, based on Zbarsky's and Vorobev's procedure. About whether or not to have an open casket, there was a sharp debate. Voroshilov, remember Voroshilov is supposed to be the Stalinist in this, Voroshilov took sharp issue with N.I. Muralov's suggestion to display the body. According to Voroshilov, we must not resort to canonization, that would be SR-like, unquote. The SRs, or social revolutionaries, they were utopian socialists who were rivals of the Bolsheviks. They were anti-Marxists, they were idealists. They didn't believe in mass organizing, they believed more in just having these brave heroes who do stuff. Or at least that's the stereotypical understanding, so that's what Voroshilov means by being like the SRs. He's saying we shouldn't display the body of this hero because that would be like the SRs. Quote, would Lenin have approved? Probably not, Dzerzhinsky admitted, because he was a person of exceptional modesty. So Dzerzhinsky is saying, yeah, Lenin wouldn't agree probably, but that's just because Lenin was so modest. He continues, but he's not here. We have only one Lenin who is not here to judge, and the question is what to do with his body, unquote. And I kind of see Dzerzhinsky's point because Lenin is biased against having his body displayed because he's modest. This is about Lenin's body, so Lenin wouldn't be an objective party in this. The same is true, by the way, of Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin. They all said the same thing. They don't want to be praised, they don't want to be seen as some kind of great heroes, they don't really care about that. But they also understand that movements have leaders. History recognizes that this is the science that Marx invented, and this is the movement and ideology that Lenin created, and Lenin was the leader. Even if Lenin doesn't like to be praised as the leader, well, he is the leader nonetheless. Let's go on. Dzerzhinsky brushed aside deep questions, noting that everybody loved Lenin. Pictures of him were treasured, everyone wanted to see him. Lenin was truly a special person. He is so dear to us that if we can preserve the body and see it, then why not do it? If science can really preserve the body for a long time, then why not do it? If it is impossible, then we won't do it. The Dzerzhinsky group won the day. It was rather an incremental process. Unquote. I can understand his reasoning. Dzerzhinsky particularly stressed that Lenin was such a special person that they wouldn't make this into a thing, but since it's Lenin, you know, Lenin is Lenin, he's a unique person. Of course, Lenin was a unique person not because of him as an individual, but because he just happened to play a certain part in the objective historical process, but nonetheless. And me personally, I think if you're unsure and if there's debate about this, then it's easier to preserve the body, and then, well, if you wanna bury it later, you can do that. But if you already bury the body and it's not preserved, and well, then there's no going back, you can't preserve it later. So I think this was the safer approach regardless. And I also understand the fact that people just kept coming and people just wanted to see Lenin. Quote, Voroshilov, as we saw above, was afraid of hypocrisy and person worship. Other Bolsheviks, like Dzerzhinsky, thought that Lenin was such a special case as to not provoke such reflections. Unquote. So Voroshilov was afraid that it would be hypocritical, since they are supposed to be against theories about great heroes making history instead of the masses making history. He was afraid that it might be hypocritical, which is understandable, but I think a little dogmatic. They'll get into those other elements of this discussion as we go on. Quote, as with preserving the body, the resistance to traditional monuments was strong. In October to November 1924, senior Bolsheviks Lunacharsky and Krasin made the case for monuments, unquote. And before we get into that, I'll just say that this idea that you can't celebrate leaders, or that you can't even build any kinds of monuments, that's clearly an ultra-left argument. The idea that we're supposed to be some kind of faceless collectivism with no leaders, no thinkers, and that we can't even have monuments of any kind, that clearly is ultra-leftist and it just goes way too far. And by the way, Lunacharsky was an important theoretician of aesthetics and art. He was the People's Commissar for Enlightenment, as they called it, which basically means that he controlled education and culture. He kinda had his own theories and own ideas about things, especially during the period when the Bolsheviks hadn't really decided yet what they thought about art and what they thought about culture. There was still a lot of ambiguity and a lot of debate, and Lunacharsky clearly had his own ideas, which sometimes were correct and sometimes were incorrect. But let's get into his actual argument. So he says, quote, the question of monuments should be seen from the point of view of the demands of the revolutionary people. The proletariat, they argued, has a solid sense of history and connection to the past. Proletarian monuments, unlike bourgeois ones, are not mere idols or signposts. Proletarian monuments are sources of strength taken from the revolutionary masses. A revolutionary monument is an active thing. It is a centralizer and transformer of social strength. Revolutionary society does great deeds and therefore has the need to immortalize itself. Lenin's tomb has already become a magnetic center for the masses who visit it, and whose literal voices of millions of people show that it answers a profound need of the masses. We are an organic, unified class doing great things, and therefore naturally monumental. They concluded, we are not anarchists, we have great and brilliant leaders. So we conclude that monuments and monumentalism are completely natural in our revolutionary life. Voroshilov, who resisted displaying the body, thought monuments were fine to maintain memory. After all, he had been to London to see Marx's grave. Unquote. I think what Lunacharsky is trying to get at is that while bourgeois monuments are something meaningless and totally empty, proletarian monuments are something that have a connection to the actual mass movement, and they represent the mass movement and they further the mass movement. And they also make the point that we are in fact not leaderless, we are not anarchists, even though actually anarchists also have leaders, they just don't admit it. But we consciously have leaders and theoreticians and thinkers. To make a monument to Lenin is completely natural and will further the revolutionary cause, and it actually would be wrong to do otherwise. Let's continue. Quote, when Lenin died, thousands of unsolicited condolence letters and telegrams spontaneously poured in. The very decision to move Lenin's body from the Hall of Columns to Red Square had to do with crowd control, and was the result of thousands of requests from the public especially from those unable to reach Moscow in time to see the body during the viewing period originally planned. The decision to build the second temporary wooden and the third permanent stone mausoleum had similar causes. The people kept coming, more than 100,000 in the first 6 weeks, despite bitter cold. Proposals poured in from the provinces to build local monuments to Lenin and to name all kinds of things for him." Unquote. So you can pretty clearly get the idea that they didn't need to centrally fabricate this in any way. They didn't need to make a top-down decision. Oh yeah, let's just preserve the body. No, the people demanded this. Thousands of letters came in. Hundreds of thousands of people came to see Lenin and pay respects. So they just had to preserve the body for a longer and longer period and make a temporary mausoleum, then make a more longer-term temporary mausoleum, and finally a permanent mausoleum. And of course this spontaneous movement to name things and name places after Lenin started. Quote, "Without permission, in Chepok Sarai, they built an exact replica of the mausoleum to be used as a book-selling kiosk. This caused much consternation in Moscow. Sailing in the wake of popular action, the regime quickly understood that they needed to gain control of this process and arrogated themselves the right to approve or disapprove such requests. Nothing could be built without their approval. Subsequently, much of the work of the Dzerzhinsky Commission consisted of approving but mostly disapproving these proposals, which included everything from a proposal for an electrified mausoleum complete with lightning bolts to renaming calendar months because, as one letter said, quote, Lenin was savior of the world more than Jesus, unquote. It's interesting how the actual truth is pretty much the complete opposite of what the anti-communist myth is. The anti-communists claim that Stalin was behind this whole thing. Well, in reality, he wasn't. The anti-communists also claim that the government had a plan to preserve the body, to basically create some kind of cult of personality, and that they just fabricated it and then they tried to spread it among the public. Whereas, in reality, it seems that the population themselves were the ones who were celebrating Lenin and saw him as a great hero, and even to the extent of saying that, yeah, I mean, why do we call things after Jesus? Lenin was actually a great liberator. He is the one who freed the people, not Jesus. So we should start naming things after Lenin. And interestingly, then the Dzerzhinsky Commission tries to control this because they don't want this to get completely out of hand. They don't want people to just build mausoleums all over the place. They might come up with things that are totally over the top. So the Dzerzhinsky Commission then tries to get some kind of control over this, and instead of massively trying to promote this spontaneous movement, they're mostly disapproving these spontaneous proposals to name things after Lenin. Which reminds me of how Stalin made at least one, but I think he actually made several proposals to ban naming things after Stalin, and at least one of them was actually passed, but then later it was overturned. So to answer the question, how did the mausoleum come about? How was the body preserved? Who decided it? Well, Getty argues that there wasn't really any kind of decision. He actually says in the book that the closest to a decision was the discussion of the committee where Dzerzhinsky says, well, if we can do it, why not do it? And then they told that to the Politburo, and the Politburo was like, alright, whatever, they accepted it. There never really was any kind of plan. There never really was any kind of decision. It just sort of happened. It was supposed to be for 3 days, then it was supposed to be for 2 weeks, then it was supposed to be for 2 months. Then they decided to preserve the body indefinitely. They debated, like, well, should we build a mausoleum? Like, okay, who should make it? What should it look like? And they debated that for 5 years. So only after 5 years did they decide, okay, well, I think it was Gusev who built the last mausoleum as well. So it kind of just happened.